Alabama scorching dust. A barefoot girl stood on the ground. She was sold like she meant nothing.
Can you believe that a cruel bargain could turn into the greatest love story a small town has ever seen? In McMullen, Alabama, the lives of John Harris and Catherine Martinez would never be the same after a trade that seemed irreversible. Their fate appeared sealed, but love managed to blossom where no one imagined it could. Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover will touch your heart. In the comments, answer this question: can love truly conquer all obstacles? Let's begin. On a hot summer afternoon, the air in McMullen, Alabama, felt heavy and suffocating. The sun burned relentlessly in the sky, reflecting the harshness of the fate that seemed to have been drawn for Catherine from the moment she was born. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her bare feet feeling the warm earth of the yard, and a growing sense of panic invaded her chest. She was just an 18-year-old girl, but that afternoon, the innocence that still remained in her heart would be brutally and relentlessly torn away. The moment that would change her life forever was already in motion. The exchange about to happen was not something she could fully comprehend. Catherine didn't know that upon leaving her parents' humble home, she would never be the same again. The dreamy girl who imagined a better future for herself, full of hopes and illusions, was about to be sold like merchandise, without a trace of dignity or humanity. David Martinez, Catherine's father, stood before her, his face hardened by the sun's heat and the marks of a difficult life in the fields. His eyes held no warmth, no affection. There was something about him that Catherine had never understood. He never wanted her around. Since she was born, it was as if she were just a reminder of a decision he preferred to forget. To him, his daughter was nothing more than a burden, a responsibility he never wanted to assume, a mistake that needed to be corrected. The man before Catherine was no longer a father. He was a seller of souls. He was there to sell his own daughter, the young woman with dreams as vast as the fields surrounding the house where she had grown up. The offer was made coldly, without any emotion. Catherine's life was being valued like an object, a product to be traded. There was no room for questions, or even a look of compassion. "I never wanted a girl in this house," David said with a harsh, cutting voice, like a blade. He looked at his daughter with disdain, almost as if she were a broken toy. "A woman is good for nothing but keeping house, cooking, and causing trouble. I need someone to help me on the ranch, someone strong, not a fragile, crying girl." His words fell like stones on Catherine's heart. She tried not to show the pain, but she knew something irreparable had happened. Her father didn't see her as a daughter, but as an obligation, a burden he wanted to be rid of. He had never loved her, and that moment would seal her life forever. "I'll sell this girl to you," David continued, turning to a man who stood before him, waiting patiently. "The trade will be for a fat cow and a few $100s. I can't stand this responsibility anymore. I don't want to take care of a girl anymore." The man before him, John Harris, watched with an impassive gaze. He was a tall rancher, his face marked by time and the hardships of the land. His expression was serious, cold, as if he had seen too much and wouldn't let himself be touched by the tragedies of others. He didn't seem to feel pity for Catherine, nor compassion for her situation. He just accepted the deal as another day's work, another negotiation he had to close. "All right," John replied in a deep voice. "I'll take the girl. But remember, this is just business. No sentimentality later." Catherine's pain seemed to pierce through every word spoken. She didn't know where she was going, nor what would happen next. The only thing she felt was the weight of rejection, of pain, the feeling that her life no longer had value. Her heart, which once pulsed with hope, was now empty, crushed by the coldness of a father who didn't know how to love. "Go on, girl," David said, turning away without looking at her. "You're no longer part of this house." With her head down and her heart broken, Catherine gathered her few belongings and followed the man who would buy her freedom for a paltry price. She didn't know what to expect from her new life. John Harris's ranch seemed like an unknown place, a land where she had no place, where she didn't know if she would be treated as a person or just as cheap labor. The journey to the ranch was long and silent. The sound of John's horse's hooves and the wind hitting her face were the only noises she heard. Nothing seemed more distant than the home where she grew up, where life had seemed simple and full of possibilities. Now, she was going to a place that represented the opposite of everything she had imagined for herself. Fate seemed cruel, but Catherine had no choice. They arrived at John Harris's ranch as the sun began to hide on the horizon. The ranch was vast, with fences stretching as far as her eyes could see. The pastures were dry, and the smell of earth mixed with that of animals dominated the air. Catherine felt a sense of helplessness as she looked at the vast terrain. It was as if she were going to a battlefield, and she was just a spectator in her own life. When she got off the wagon, John watched her with a look that seemed to measure every inch of her figure. Without a word, he pointed to the main house, indicating for her to follow. The weight of each step was stronger than any words he could have said. "This is how it is here," John spoke in a deep voice. "If you want to stay, you have to learn fast. There's no room for fussiness." Catherine swallowed her tears, forcing herself to walk. Her body was tired, her spirit broken, but she knew she couldn't give up. Even if the weight of rejection suffocated her, she knew she had to be strong, not just to survive, but to show herself that she was capable of more than she thought. Margaret, the ranch's cook, was the one who received her. The woman, though smiling, seemed distant, perhaps accustomed to John's coldness. She handed Catherine an apron, and without many words, put her to work. The young woman knew nothing about what she needed to do. The ranch routine was completely new to her. The following days were marked by exhaustion and loneliness. The sun burned her skin as she learned to care for the cattle, sweep the yard, clean the house, and cook. John was always nearby, watching, but never helping. When Catherine made a mistake, he didn't hide his impatience. "I already told you to do it this way, not your way," he would grumble, crossing his arms and looking at her with disdain. Catherine tried her best. She didn't want to fail, but the weight of John's words, her father's merciless gaze, and the loneliness of that ranch seemed to crush her every day. She wondered how many more times she would have to endure this pain before finding a way out. Her soul was broken, but somewhere inside her, she still had a flame of hope. The flame that made her believe that maybe one day she could find a place where she was accepted, where she could feel loved. But that day seemed distant, perhaps even impossible. How would you react if you were Catherine after being rejected by your own father? What do you think she will do to move forward? McMullen was a small town, but John Harris's ranch seemed endless. The vastness of the land was imposing, and the constantly clear and sunny Alabama sky seemed to weigh on Catherine with an almost oppressive heat. The silence that enveloped the place was absolute, only broken by the sounds of animals and the occasional breeze blowing between the sheds and fences. It was a different life from the one she knew, harder, lonelier. At first, Catherine didn't know what to do. She didn't know how she could fit into that place, so far from everything she had known. She lacked the necessary skills for the work, which made her feel even more helpless. John's ranch was not a place for mistakes, and she found herself constantly being watched by him, who seemed to study her every move, as if she were an experiment being conducted. John didn't say much, but his presence made the young woman feel smaller. He was a man of few words and no kindness. His eyes, which always seemed insensitive, followed Catherine from a distance, showing no understanding or empathy. For him, what mattered was the work and the completion of tasks, not the well-being or feelings of those around him. But, although the first days were difficult, something inside Catherine began to change. Even without knowing how, she knew she had to try harder than ever to survive in that place. The thought of returning to McMullen with the feeling of failure was unacceptable. She was determined to learn, to prove to herself that she was capable, even if pain and exhaustion consumed her at every moment. As the days passed, Catherine got used to the hard work. The first attempts at handling the cattle, cleaning the stables, and preparing meals were not easy. She got hurt several times, with calloused hands and sore feet. But every time she made a mistake, she got back up. There was no more room for weakness. If she wanted to stay there, she had to show she had the necessary strength. But John remained a distant and intimidating figure. Whenever she made a mistake, his harsh and impatient voice made her feel even more lost. He didn't care that she was a novice, that she had never lived on a ranch before. For him, she either learned fast or she would be of no more use. The physical pain Catherine felt in her body seemed small compared to the emotional pain his words caused. The silence between them was as thick as the heat of the town they lived in and seemed increasingly difficult to bear. Catherine tried to focus on her tasks, but she couldn't shake the feeling of rejection that accompanied her all the time. She wondered what else she needed to do to prove she could be useful, that she could fit into that rough world. But so far, all she felt was immense loneliness, an emptiness in her chest she didn't know how to fill. On a particularly hot afternoon, as the sun was about to set and the temperature finally began to drop a little, Catherine was in the stable, trying to learn how to milk a cow. Her hands trembled as she tried to find the rhythm, but her fingers failed. The milk spilled, and she felt increasingly frustrated. She looked to the side, hoping John was far away, but to her surprise, he was standing at the stable door, watching her in silence. "You're doing it wrong," he said in his gruff voice, but this time, something in his tone seemed different. Maybe it was just a little softer, or maybe it was just the usual lack of patience, but something made Catherine look up at him. I don't know how," she replied, trying to hide the frustration in her voice. "I've never done this before." John watched her for a few more seconds, as if assessing her sincerity, and then walked over to her. He took her hands firmly, guiding her movements calmly, though without the gentleness she wished for. His rough, calloused hands touched hers, and for a moment, Catherine was in shock. He was touching her, something that would never happen under any other circumstance. But at that moment, it was just a mechanical gesture, a direction without any visible emotion. John's expression was unchanging, as always. "It has to be firm, but with rhythm," he said, his voice deep and emotionless. "Force is no use. It has to be at the right pace." Catherine, still a bit surprised, followed his instructions, trying to imitate the movement as carefully as possible. To her surprise, she began to be able to milk the cow more easily, and even without a smile or a word of praise, John's presence beside her made her feel, for the first time, a little more confident. He watched her for a few more minutes, and then, without saying anything else, he walked away, without a word of encouragement or support. But, deep down, Catherine knew that, somehow, his gesture meant something. Maybe it wasn't compassion, but maybe it was respect. Even if John wasn't a man of many words, maybe he was starting to see something in Catherine, something she didn't even know she had. That night, as she lay in her simple room and felt her body ache from so much work, a strange feeling washed over her. It was a mixture of relief and fear, but also of curiosity. Something inside her seemed to have changed, though she didn't know exactly what. John's gesture, however small, was perhaps the first sign that he was beginning to see her differently. What do you think changed in John's behavior? Is he starting to care about Catherine, or is it still just a matter of necessity? How do you think she will react to this new gesture from him? Write it down in the comments. The days on John Harris's ranch dragged on slowly, and each one seemed harder than the last. Catherine no longer felt the scorching heat of McMullen in the same way as before. Her skin was marked by the sun and daily efforts, but what weighed on her most was not physical exhaustion, but the emotional emptiness that seemed to grow deeper. Every task she performed seemed to be just another vain attempt to prove she deserved to be there. John's behavior remained impassive. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were dry and emotionless. Catherine knew she wasn't welcome there, but something inside her refused to give up. She wanted to learn, wanted to prove she was capable of more, that she could be strong as he expected. However, with each mistake, she felt the pain of rejection more strongly, like a cold blade piercing her heart. However, there was something different in those days, something Catherine couldn't immediately identify, but that was beginning to form between her and John. A small gesture, a look, something she never imagined would come from a man so hardened by life. He began to watch her efforts more attentively, though he never said anything. And as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, Catherine couldn't ignore the fact that he was there, more present than before. It was on an afternoon when the sun was beginning to set on the horizon, creating long shadows over the fields of McMullen, that something unexpected happened. Catherine was in the corral, trying for the 1,000th time to learn how to milk a cow. Her hands were tired, her fingers numb from so much effort, but she didn't give up. The cow, one of the most nervous on the ranch, didn't make it easy. The milk spilled, and she felt stress take over her body, but she didn't want to give up, didn't want to fail again. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Catherine looked up and saw John standing in front of her. He was watching her, as he always did, but this time there was something different in his expression. It was almost as if he were waiting. He didn't say a word, but the look they exchanged was enough for Catherine to understand that he was, for the first time, willing to help. Without a single word, he approached and, with an almost imperceptible movement, took her hands and positioned them correctly on the pail. He guided her movements calmly but firmly, as if he were genuinely trying to teach and not just correct. Catherine felt, for a moment, disconcerted. She was so used to his coldness that she didn't know how to react. But the gentleness in his gestures, though simple, touched something inside her. "This is how you do it," he said, his voice softer than usual. The change in his tone was subtle, but Catherine noticed it. He was speaking patiently, as if he truly cared. To her, this was almost a miracle. It was the first time he hadn't treated her like a burden, like something to be discarded, but as someone who was there to learn and grow. Catherine's heart raced with John's proximity, but she tried to stay calm. Her face was hot, not just from the sun, but from the intensity of the moment. With each movement of her hands, she felt the weight of something new forming between them, a connection she never imagined possible. But, at the same time, the fear that it was all an illusion made her hesitate. John was unpredictable. His actions often seemed motivated only by necessity. So why was he being different now? He stayed there with her for a few more minutes, watching her attentively. His eyes were no longer closed off, no longer impassive. He was somehow truly attentive to her. For Catherine, that seemed like a monumental step forward. He wasn't just seeing a young woman trying to learn to work on the ranch. He was seeing her, really. And that, as simple as it seemed, was something she never imagined would happen. When he finished teaching her the correct movement, he walked away without saying anything more. He looked one last time at Catherine and then walked away in silence. But this time, the young woman didn't feel defeated, as she had so many times before. Instead, she felt something new in her heart, a flame, still small, but full of hope. He had somehow seen her, and that meant more than any correction or order. As she finished her work, her thoughts were swirling. What did that gesture from John mean? Was he really starting to care about her? Or was it just an isolated moment, a momentary weakness? Catherine knew she had to continue her daily struggle to survive on that ranch. But now, with a new impulse in her heart, she felt that something inside her had changed, and that motivated her to keep trying. That night, when Catherine lay down in her simple bed and looked at the wooden ceiling, something in her was different. She felt that, despite all the suffering and loneliness that still surrounded her, she was no longer alone. John, in an unexpected way, had become part of her story of overcoming. What do you think motivated John to change his attitude? Is he starting to see Catherine differently? Or was it just an isolated moment of kindness? Comment below. Let's share what we're thinking. The heat of McMullen was relentless, and the work on the ranch seemed endless. Every day was a constant battle for Catherine, who was getting used to the harsh reality of her new life. Time on the ranch passed slowly, as if the sun had decided to stop and watch her struggle. She would get up before dawn, her muscles still sore from the previous day, and start her day without any rest, facing another series of tasks that seemed to have no end. John Harris's ranch offered no room for error. Catherine was already aware of this. Every mistake she made, every failure, made her feel as if she were sinking deeper into that sea of rejection and loneliness. If she didn't learn fast, if she didn't start to fit in, she knew she would have no more value there. It was a constant pressure that made her work to the limits of her body, seeking in each task the recognition that never came. Physical exhaustion was becoming a constant companion. Catherine felt pain in her back, hands, and legs, and her skin, now marked by the Alabama sun, was increasingly sensitive. But despite the difficulties, something inside her was strengthening. What once seemed an unbearable burden now became a mission. She had to survive. She began to realize that if she wanted to stay there, she needed to learn to fend for herself. John, though present, never offered direct help. He watched from a distance, always with that relentless expression, but never said anything. It was as if he were waiting for her to take the initiative, for her to prove she had the necessary strength to be a valuable part of that ranch. In the first few days, Catherine tried to fit in, tried to learn everything as quickly as possible. She cared for the cattle, fed the animals, and cleaned the sheds in the hope that one day John would recognize her effort. But he always kept his distance, and his lack of words made her feel invisible. Still, she didn't give up. Every small progress she made, every completed task, was a small step towards acceptance, even if it was just self-acceptance. It was on a particularly difficult day, when the routine seemed to be crushing her shoulders, that Catherine faced a task that made her question everything she knew. She was assigned to care for a cow that was about to give birth, something she had never done before. The cow's pregnancy was complicated, and the signs were worrying. Catherine didn't know what to do. She had no one to ask for help. John was there, but he didn't seem to care about the cow's condition. She was alone, with an animal that depended on her to survive. Panic took over Catherine. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to help, and the fear of failure was overwhelming. However, something inside her awakened. She couldn't just give up. The cow was suffering, and she knew she had to try. With trembling hands, Catherine approached the cow and began to watch more closely. She remembered some instructions she had heard from John and Margaret, the cook, about how to handle cattle. It was now or never. Pain and fear guided her, but the young woman couldn't let it stop her from acting. She used all her strength to hold the cow while trying to assist in the birth. The task was arduous, and the animal was agitated, but Catherine persisted. Sweat dripped from her face, mixed with the dust of the field, but she didn't stop. Time seemed to drag on, but finally, after long minutes of tension and effort, she succeeded. The calf was born, weak but alive. Catherine, exhausted and in shock, looked at the calf and then at the cow, which was now calmer. She felt relieved, but also deeply proud. She had done it alone, with no one to guide her. She had proven to herself that she was capable. But, as she lifted her head, she saw John standing at the stable door, watching her in silence. He hadn't approached to help, but the look in his eyes was different. It was as if he had, for the first time, seen something in her that he hadn't before. There was a recognition there, something she had never felt from him. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. But for Catherine, that meant more than any words. She knew that that gesture, that moment of recognition, was the key to something bigger. Even if John didn't speak, even if he didn't express his admiration, she knew he had seen what she was capable of. She had proven to him and to herself that she could survive in this harsh land. That night, when Catherine lay in her simple bed, her body tired and marked by work, she smiled to herself. She knew there was still much to do, much to learn, but something inside her had changed. She was beginning to find her place on that ranch. She was beginning to find her strength. Time in McMullen seemed to stretch even longer as the summer heat gave way to the softness of cooler nights. But for Catherine, the constant pressure to prove herself and survive did not diminish. Every day she got up early, facing her tasks with the same determination, but she felt a deep exhaustion. The marks on her hands became more and more visible, calluses from so much work, from so much fighting to fit into a world that seemed not to want her. And yet, something inside her was transforming, something she couldn't identify, but that began to sprout from her soul with each completed task. John, on the other hand, continued his routine of detachment. He was always there, but from a distance. He watched Catherine's every step, like a distant and indifferent spectator, without getting involved. She knew he didn't talk much, but what she saw in his eyes, those moments when she felt his heavy gaze on her, said more than any words. The impression that he was watching her, judging her, and ultimately ignoring her, was what tormented her. Still, Catherine persisted. She continued to do the work, learning what she could, facing each new day as if it were her last. But something inside her, something she couldn't name, made her keep going. She refused to accept the idea of being just a spectator in her own life. She needed to have control over her destiny, no matter how difficult it was. The pain, though constant, was becoming more bearable. It was then, on a stuffy afternoon, when everything changed. Catherine was in the corral, again dealing with the cattle. This time, she was trying to learn how to cut hay for the animals. Her arms were tired and her hands, once again, no longer responded as they used to. The work was arduous and the heat gave no rest. She felt the muscles in her arms burning with each movement, But still, she didn't stop. Sweat ran down her face, and her breathing was ragged. That's when John appeared. He wasn't at a distance, as usual. He was there, close, watching her every move attentively. He said nothing at first, but his presence there seemed different. Catherine continued her work, trying to ignore the growing sense of nervousness she felt. She knew he was watching. The tension in the air was palpable. And then, surprisingly, he approached. Without a word, he picked up one of the tools and began to show Catherine how to cut the hay more efficiently. He leaned towards her, not with the coldness she was used to, but with a subtle gentleness, a patience she never imagined he had. His eyes were fixed on the work, but something in his tone of voice indicated that he was more present. "You have to hold it like this, so you don't lose your strength," he said, his voice calmer and firmer than usual. He indicated the position of her hands, adjusting them gently. Catherine felt his touch, and a wave of heat ran through her body, but she didn't pull away. It was strange, feeling this closeness, but something in her told her that this gesture meant more than a simple correction. She continued to cut the hay with him by her side, and the silence between them no longer seemed so heavy. There was something different about that moment. John was there, guiding her, but without rush, without the harshness she knew. He seemed to be, for the first time, treating her as something more than a simple ranch hand. It was as if, in that moment, he saw her, not as a worthless person, but as someone with whom he could share a bit of his experience. Catherine, for her part, felt strangely welcomed. She felt that this simple gesture, the help with the hay, was giving her a new view of John. He wasn't just the man who bought her, the cold and distant man. He was, in that instant, someone who cared, who was willing to teach, and for her, that meant more than any words he could have said. "See, now it's easier. The hay won't come loose if you do it like this," he said after a few minutes, with a slight smile on his face, which Catherine rarely saw. The feeling of discomfort she felt with him began to disappear little by little. It wasn't something romantic or sentimental, but a slight change in how she saw him. He was no longer just a rigid and merciless man. He also had an ability to be patient and careful, though it was something he rarely showed. When the work was done, he looked at her, as if expecting some kind of reaction, but Catherine didn't know what to say. He hadn't spoken much, but the change in his behavior, however subtle, had been enough to touch her. He had treated her as someone worthy of his attention, and even if the gesture was small, it was enough for her to start wondering if there was more to their relationship than she had imagined. John walked away, returning to where he had come from, without saying anything more. But the feeling that something had changed was undeniable. Catherine knew that this gesture had been important, not just for the work, but for the relationship between them. She knew that John was not an easy person to understand, but that small sign of kindness, that unexpected touch, gave her a new perspective on him. That night, as she lay in her bed, tired, but with a strange feeling that something was about to happen, she reflected on what she had just experienced. John was starting to open up, even if slowly and with small gestures, but somehow, he was beginning to see in her something more than a simple employee. Do you think John's gesture was sincere or just a forced action? How do you think his attitude will change the relationship between him and Catherine from now on? The sky over McMullen, Alabama, seemed calmer that night, with a gentle wind blowing through the trees and scattering the ranch dust. The moonlight illuminated the field, casting a silver tone on the fences and sheds. It was a quiet night, but for Catherine, the stillness seemed deceptive. Despite the visible peace in the environment, her mind was far away, still processing the recent change that had begun to happen on the ranch, and especially in her relationship with John. That afternoon, when he approached and taught her how to cut hay correctly, seemed to have marked a difference in everything. She felt as if an invisible wall between her and John was beginning to crumble, albeit slowly and imperceptibly. The simple gesture, that touch on her hands as he helped her, had shown that he no longer saw her just as a work tool, but as a person capable of learning, of improving. For Catherine, this was a sign. It was the first real sign that she could truly find her place on the ranch. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she was beginning to realize that John wasn't as closed off as he appeared. There was something more to him, a humanity he tried to hide, but which, little by little, was revealing itself. And what was most surprising to her was that this was beginning to stir her own feelings, not in a romantic way, but with a new understanding of the man with whom she shared that arid space. She began to wonder if, with time, there might be more between them than a simple survival pact. But, as always, John remained distant. He continued to be the reserved and impassive man he always was, revealing none of his emotions. And Catherine knew she couldn't expect much more from him. She had learned to survive on the ranch with calloused hands and sore muscles, but now, a new struggle was taking shape in her mind. She needed to understand what was happening there, between her and John, without deluding herself with small, momentary gestures. After all, in McMullen, the harsh reality of the countryside didn't allow for softness. It was on that night, after a long day of work in the fields, that an unexpected conversation took place. Catherine was on the porch, tired, but with her gaze fixed on the stars, trying to find some kind of peace in the vastness of the sky. She liked to lose herself in that immensity. She thought about her life, the choices that brought her there, and the decisions she still had to make. Her mind was full of questions, but she had no answers. That's when she heard John's footsteps approaching. He appeared at the porch door, as if he knew she was there, but without saying a word. Catherine didn't know what to expect. He approached slowly, the soft nightlight reflecting on his hard face, and stood there, next to her, for a moment. He said nothing, but his presence was almost palpable, as if he were waiting for the right moment to speak. "Do you always look at the sky like that?" he finally asked, breaking the silence that hung between them. Catherine didn't know if she should answer, but the question was so simple that there seemed to be no other choice. She looked at him, noticing for the first time how John's expression was softer, as if something inside him had changed. She sighed, looking at the stars again. "Sometimes, yes. I like to get lost in them," she replied, her voice calmer than she imagined. John watched her for a moment, and then, without moving, said something that took her by surprise. "I used to do that too. I'd look at the sky and wonder what I was doing with my life. But that was before." He hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "Before life taught me there's not much to expect. You just have to do what needs to be done." Catherine felt a weight in his words, but also noticed the vulnerability in his voice. She knew he was trying to open up, even if subtly, and it made her feel a tightness in her chest. It was hard to imagine John, the impassive man she had met at the beginning, thinking about the same things she did. "I understand," she replied with a shy smile. "But sometimes, you need to look at what's beyond, at what isn't visible. Sometimes what's in the stars can show us a path." John was silent for a moment, as if Catherine's words had touched a place inside him. He said nothing more, but his gaze seemed softer now, more attentive. "Maybe," he murmured, without much conviction, "but around here, the only path is the one that leads to survival." Catherine felt the conversation was coming to an end, but she wanted more. She wanted to know more about what was going on in John's head, wanted to understand the man he was, but she knew he wouldn't open up all at once. She, who had already grown accustomed to his silence and harshness, knew that patience was the key to understanding her new companion on this journey. "Well," she said, breaking the ensuing silence, "maybe what matters is that we try to understand what's here, now, and not what's past, or what might come." John looked at her for a moment, and his eyes shone for an instant with something Catherine couldn't identify. He then nodded, as if agreeing with what she had said, but spoke no more. He took a step back, as if the conversation was over, and slowly walked away, back into the house. Catherine, though still with so many questions, felt a sense of relief. Something was changing between them, albeit silently and gradually. She stood there, on the porch, looking at the stars once more, now with a feeling of hope that didn't exist before. The ice was beginning to melt, and although it was a slow process, she knew a change was happening. Perhaps deep down, what she most desired was not to understand John immediately, but to be able to help him understand himself. Do you think John is really starting to open up to Catherine? Life on John Harris's ranch continued to be difficult, but there was something different about Catherine, something she couldn't fully identify, but that made her keep going every day. Maybe it was the persistence that had become part of her essence. Maybe it was the way she was beginning to see the small victories of her journey. The McMullen, Alabama, ranch was still vast and silent, but the emptiness in her chest was beginning to fill with new, small, and significant experiences. John, for his part, remained an enigmatic man. Sometimes he seemed more distant than ever. At others, it seemed like an opening, a breach, was beginning to form between him and Catherine. It was a slow process, but she was starting to notice small changes. What seemed to be an impenetrable wall was little by little becoming easier to cross. It was on a hot August afternoon, when the McMullen heat seemed almost unbearable, that Catherine, unintentionally, started a conversation that would change everything. She was in the barn, checking on the cattle, when she heard John's footsteps approaching. He was silent, as always, but on that day, he seemed to be in a different state of mind. He seemed less closed off, less impersonal. Something in him was about to be revealed, and Catherine felt it in every fiber of her being. She turned to him, intending only to greet him and continue with her work. But John, for the first time in a long time, didn't let her carry on with the routine. He stopped at the barn door, watching her in silence, as if preparing to speak. "Have you ever wondered why I'm like this?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer than usual. The question caught Catherine by surprise. She looked at him, trying to process his words. "Like what?" she asked, not quite understanding where the conversation was going. John paused before answering, as if trying to organize his thoughts. "Hard, closed off, impossible to please," he said, the tone of his voice carrying a subtle melancholy. "Sometimes I wonder what made me this way, what made me push away the world, everyone around me." Catherine looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability he was beginning to show. She never imagined he would speak openly about his feelings, but there he was, opening a door she knew had been closed for a long time. She hesitated for a moment, but decided not to let the opportunity pass. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I see the way you are with everyone, and sometimes it seems like you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. But I think everyone has their reasons for being that way, for closing themselves off. No one is just cold and insensitive by chance." John seemed to ponder her words. He ran a hand over his sparse beard, a gesture she had begun to notice whenever he was thinking deeply. Silence hung between them for a few seconds, and then he finally spoke, his words coming out cautiously, as if he were trying to free himself from a weight. "I've lost a lot, Catherine," he began, looking at the floor, as if the words were easier to say if he didn't have to look her in the eye. "I lost my mother when I was still a child. She died when I was only 10. My father wasn't exactly an easy man to live with, and he distanced himself from me even more after her death. He locked himself in his own suffering, and I had to learn to fend for myself. I didn't have much of a chance to be a kid." Catherine felt the weight of his words, but didn't know what to say. She knew this was the first time John had really talked about his past, about the losses he had faced, and it made her see him in a completely different way. Until that moment, she had seen him as a grumpy and closed-off man. But now, she understood that he had a story, a past that had shaped him very deeply. "And then, when I was 18, my wife died. She died in childbirth when we were expecting our son. It was fast. Cancer, which took her in just 3 months," John continued, the pain still visible in his voice, despite trying to hide it. "I was left alone with Tommy, and I never knew how to deal with it. The loss of my mother and the death of my wife destroyed me, Catherine. And so I closed myself off. I didn't want to feel anymore, didn't want anything to hurt me again. So I became this." He gestured with his hands, as if to show the coldness and hardness that defined him. Catherine was silent, absorbing every word. She didn't know what to say, but she felt a wave of compassion for him. She never imagined that John had faced so many losses. She saw him as the unbeatable man, but now he was there, before her, vulnerable and human. She approached him, her heart tight with the pain he was revealing. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words coming from her mouth with a sincerity she didn't know she had inside her. "I didn't know what you went through, John, but I understand. Losing someone like that, it must be the hardest thing in the world. And, as much as you try to push the world away, I think a part of you is still trying to find a way to heal those wounds." John looked at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them before. He was more vulnerable than he ever imagined he would be, and it made him feel, somehow, lighter. He still didn't know how to deal with the pain, with the emptiness he felt, but there was Catherine, listening to him, without judgment, without rushing him to change. She was just there, understanding him. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted. "I don't know how to change, how to open up to people. Life taught me to close myself off, to protect what was left of me. But with you, Catherine, maybe I'm starting to see that not all is lost." Catherine smiled slightly, a soft smile that reflected the compassion she felt for him. She knew the healing process would be long and difficult, but she felt that something important had begun to happen there, on that distant ranch in McMullen. Time passed quickly in McMullen, and the seasons began to change. The summer heat gave way to the coolness of autumn, and John Harris's ranch seemed calmer, as if nature were responding to the subtle change happening within him. Catherine, who once felt like an intruder, now felt more at home. She had learned not only to care for the ranch, but also to deal with her own feelings, and perhaps John's as well. The days that once seemed long and heavy now passed more quickly. Catherine no longer felt alone in that vast space. She had found her place, her purpose, and it made her feel stronger every day. She was no longer just a woman trying to survive in a world that seemed to want nothing to do with her. She was becoming someone who had a voice, someone who was beginning to be respected for her strength and dedication. But at the same time, she knew there was still a part of the story that was not complete. John's story, the truth about him, the reason he was so closed off and distant. John's silence, which once seemed incomprehensible, was beginning to make sense. He was still a man of few words, but something had changed in him. Every day, he opened up more, even if just a little. Catherine knew he still carried many scars, but she also knew he was beginning to let those scars heal, slowly. It was on a cold autumn night, as Catherine was on the porch looking at the stars, that she finally got the answer she had been looking for. She had grown accustomed to John's silence, but on that night, he approached her differently. He wasn't distant, as he used to be. He seemed lighter. John sat next to Catherine, without saying a word. For a moment, they both sat in silence, sharing the tranquility of the night. The sound of crickets and the cool wind cutting through the air were the only things to be heard. "Do you still think about the stars?" John asked suddenly, breaking the silence in a way Catherine didn't expect. She looked at him, surprised by the question. For a moment she was silent, remembering the conversation they had months ago, when she talked about how she liked to look at the sky. "Yes, sometimes," she replied with a soft smile. "It's the only place where I can feel that there's something bigger, something that gives me hope, no matter how hard life is." John looked at the sky too, and Catherine could see a slight change in his face. He was distant, as if her words were touching something inside him. "I used to look at the stars too," he said, in a low, melancholic tone. "But after I lost my mother and my wife, I stopped looking at the sky. I stopped looking for something bigger. I only saw the ground, the work, survival. I couldn't see what was up there anymore." Catherine felt a pain in her chest hearing this. She knew he carried a deep pain, but she never imagined he had closed himself off so completely. She didn't know how he had endured it all alone. "John," she began, hesitating, "I can't imagine what you've been through, but maybe the stars can still show you something. Maybe you can start looking for something beyond the pain again." John looked at her, and his eyes, normally cold, were now softer. He seemed to contemplate her words, but was visibly struggling with his own feelings. He had never known how to deal with his pain, how to face his losses. For a long time, he thought that if he closed himself off, became insensitive, the pain would disappear. But Catherine made him see that this wasn't true. He still felt, he still carried everything inside him. And, as difficult as it was, he needed to face it. "I don't know if I can," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I've been closed off for so long, Catherine. I'm afraid to feel all that again, afraid the pain will swallow me." She looked at him with a look full of understanding. "I know it's hard, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here. You don't have to be afraid to open your heart. It's not weakness, John. It's strength, and you're stronger than you imagine." John was silent for a few minutes, looking at her, as if trying to understand what she was saying. He wasn't used to asking for help. He refused to show his pain. But something in her was making him rethink his beliefs. He knew that if he continued like this, he would lose himself, and perhaps worst of all, lose the only good thing in his life now. "Catherine, I don't know how to do this," he said, almost whispering, as if the words were harder to get out than he imagined. "I don't know how to let go of the past." "You don't have to let go of everything. Catherine replied with a soft smile. "You just need to start looking forward, and when you're ready, I'll be here to help you take the next step." John looked at her, his gaze now more open, more vulnerable. For the first time, he was allowing someone to see him, to get close to his heart. And for the first time, he felt that maybe it was possible to open up to something bigger, something more than the pain and suffering he had carried for so long. That night, John and Catherine were silent, but there was something new between them, something that was beginning to grow, something they both knew they needed, but which, until then, they hadn't realized. The ice was breaking, slowly but surely. The McMullen, Alabama, ranch seemed to be in a state of rare calm that night. The gentle wind danced among the trees, and the starry sky stretched across the vastness like a canvas of promises and hopes. The atmosphere was silent, but at the same time, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. Something that, until that moment, seemed impossible was about to happen. Catherine was on the porch, as she had been so many times before, looking at the stars. But on that night, something inside her was different. The weight of the pain and suffering she carried in the early days seemed to have disappeared. Now, she looked to the future with a sense of lightness, as if she had finally found her place, as if what she was looking for was right there, within her reach. Her mind was full of thoughts, but one stood out above the others: John. He had opened up to her in a way she never imagined. The man who seemed impossible to reach was now approaching her heart, no longer as the distant rancher from before, but as someone who was, finally, willing to take a risk. He was no longer just the man who had bought her, the man who treated her with indifference. He was now someone with whom she shared a journey, a man who was learning to open up, to surrender. At that moment, the porch door opened and John appeared. He was quiet, as always, but something in his posture was different. He seemed lighter, more at peace. Maybe it was the weight of the words he had finally released, or maybe it was the understanding that, finally, he could live without the fear of losing what he had. He stood next to Catherine, but said nothing immediately. The two stood there in silence, looking at the sky. Catherine felt that finally, she had reached that point of balance, where nothing more needed to be said for them to understand each other. The simple fact of being together, sharing that space, already said everything. It was John who broke the silence, with a soft but emotional voice. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, Catherine," he began, the words coming out more easily than he imagined. "Someone who would help me see that life can be different, that I can be different." Catherine turned to him, her heart beating faster with the intensity of his words. She knew that this moment, this conversation, was the turning point she had been waiting for. They had taken the first steps to truly know each other, and now it was time to surrender, to allow themselves to live the truth that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. "I never imagined I'd find someone like you either, John," she replied, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Someone who could see me for who I really am, beyond what I show the world. Someone who made me believe that we can start over, no matter how lost we've been along the way." They were silent again, but this time, the silence was comforting. There were no more barriers between them, no more fears, no doubts. They were there, together, and that was enough. Without another word, John approached Catherine. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, but it wasn't the tension of doubt or fear. It was the tension of surrender, of the silent promise that they would take the next step, the step that would change everything. John extended his hand to her, and without hesitation, Catherine took it. They looked into each other's eyes, and there, in that silent exchange, were all the words that didn't need to be said. John pulled her closer, and Catherine allowed herself to be guided by him. When their bodies finally touched, the world around them disappeared. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the connection between them, the truth that had formed little by little, and that, now, could no longer be ignored. Their kiss started slowly, but soon intensified, as if they had both been waiting for that moment for a long time. John, with a gentleness and passion he had never shown before, kissed Catherine with an intensity she never imagined he was capable of. He was no longer the man hardened by the pain of the past. He was there, with her, fully present, fully surrendered. Catherine, in turn, returned the kiss with the same intensity. She knew this was the beginning of something new, something she never imagined would be possible. The fear she felt when she arrived at that ranch, the fear of being rejected, the fear of not being enough, was disappearing in the face of that moment of pure surrender. They were two hearts that had found each other, two worlds that had finally united. When the kiss ended, they both stood there, facing each other, their hearts still racing. John, still breathing heavily, looked into Catherine's eyes and, for the first time, smiled. It was a sincere smile, without reservations, without fears. "I don't know what the future holds for us," he said, his voice soft and full of meaning. "But I know that, with you, I want to face everything, together." Catherine smiled back, feeling a sense of peace wash over her body. She knew there was something true in that moment, something that could not be ignored. They had overcome so many barriers, so many fears, and now, finally, they were ready to live what was to come, together. "I want that too, John," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "I want to face the future with you too." And so, on that night, under the stars of McMullen, Alabama, John and Catherine surrendered to love. They knew the journey would not be easy, but together they could overcome any obstacle. Their love was not just a story of overcoming, it was the story of two souls who had finally found their place in the world. We have reached the end of this emotional journey of overcoming, love, and transformation between Catherine and John. Their story is a powerful reminder that love can blossom in the most unexpected places, even when the pains of the past prevent us from seeing the possibility of a happy future. Now, we want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Do you believe their love will be able to overcome all the challenges that may still arise? Leave your comment below and share your ideas on how this story might continue to evolve. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more emotional stories like this, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Oh, and don't forget to check out the next recommended video. We have beautiful stories of transformation and overcoming to share with you.
In Alabama's scorching dust, a barefoot girl stood on the ground. She was sold like she meant nothing by the man who should have held her down. In her eyes the world was trembling, her heart still soft, her soul undone. But in the silence of a distant ranch, a broken spirit had just begun. And even if the wind would burn and the sun would weigh like chains, she rooted herself in that dry red earth through bleeding hands and aching pain. Under the sky of McMullen she cried, but never let her fire die. In the cold heart of a hardened man, she planted what no one could find. From a loveless steel bloomed something true on the ranch where hope withdrew, where all seemed lost and torn apart. She chose to grow and start. He was stone locked deep inside, scars from grief he tried to hide, but in her gaze he saw sky of McMullen she stayed, when all signs told her to run. In the heat of labor she dared to pray for light beneath that sun. From a cage of dust and pain she built her name, not shame. And where the world had closed the door, she reached for more. The ranch no longer stood in silence. It echoed with something new. The man who once knew only violence was now learning what hearts do. She wasn't a shadow, wasn't a trade. She was soul, fire, and shade. And he who once vowed never to feel found truth in something real. Under the sky of McMullen they danced, with the moon as witness high. In the place where sorrow was last, they kissed the past goodbye. For love once buried deep in scars rose through broken parts, and two lost hearts, once torn and bruised, chose to fuse as stars.